The stench of whiskey and cheap tobacco hung heavy in the air as Grace Gallagher stepped off the train at Silver Creek, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1878. Her legs trembled, both from the 3-day journey and the knowledge that in moments she would meet the man who had paid for her passage from Boston to become his wife. The platform bustled with activity as porters unloaded trunks and crates while townsfolk greeted loved ones returning home. Grace stood alone, clutching her single valise containing everything she owned in the world, her eyes scanning the crowd for a face she had only seen in a small, faded daguerreotype. Miss Gallagher? A thin, middle-aged man with spectacles and a receding hairline approached her. His clothes were fine but showed signs of wear at the cuffs. "I'm Theodore Wilkins, attorney for Mr. Emmett Pierce." Grace nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, sir. I'm Grace Gallagher. Is Mr. Pierce not here to meet me?" She tried to hide her disappointment, though she had imagined this moment countless times during the long journey west. The attorney's expression tightened. "I'm afraid there's been a complication, Miss Gallagher. If you would follow me to my office, we can discuss the matter privately." Dread pooled in her stomach as she followed Mr. Wilkins to a small office across from the depot. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit in a worn leather chair facing his desk. "Miss Gallagher, I regret to inform you that Mr. Pierce has reconsidered his proposal." He adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Upon receiving your most recent photograph, he determined that you were not what he had expected." Grace's face burned with humiliation. "Not what he expected? I don't understand." "He indicated that you appeared more robust than he had anticipated. He prefers a more delicate woman." The attorney couldn't meet her eyes. "He has instructed me to provide you with return fare to Boston and his apologies." Grace sat stunned, her hands twisting in her lap. The small photograph she had sent taken on her 22nd birthday just 3 months ago had shown her truthfully. She was not delicate, true enough. At 5 feet 7 inches with strong shoulders from years of hard work, she had never been considered dainty. But robust was merely a polite substitute for too big, too strong, or simply too much. She swallowed hard. "I see. The eastbound train departs tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I've secured a ticket for you." He slid an envelope across the desk. "There's also enough money for a room at the boarding house tonight and meals. Mr. Pierce wishes you well." "Mr. Pierce can go straight to hell," Grace said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. She stood, her spine rigid. "I will not crawl back to Boston in shame because some man I've never met finds me unsuitable based on a photograph." "Miss Gallagher, please," Mr. Wilkins sputtered. "A woman alone in the territories, it's not safe or proper. You have no connections here, no employment prospects. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Grace laughed bitterly. Was it reasonable to travel nearly 2,000 miles on the promise of a marriage only to be rejected sight unseen? "I sold everything I couldn't carry to get here, Mr. Wilkins. There's nothing for me in Boston." "Nevertheless, Mr. Pierce's decision is final." He stood as well, clearly eager to conclude their business. "I'll escort you back to the depot. Perhaps you'll reconsider by morning." The walk back to the train station passed in a blur. Grace felt the curious stares of townsfolk as the attorney led her to a bench on the platform. Her humiliation was complete when he handed her valise to the stationmaster with instructions that she was to board the eastbound train in the morning. "Wait here," Mr. Wilkins said. "I'll send someone from the boarding house to collect you for the night." He departed swiftly, leaving Grace alone on the bench, fighting back tears that would give the gathering onlookers further spectacle. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she removed her bonnet, past caring about freckles or propriety. What did it matter now? "Excuse me, miss." A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Couldn't help but notice you seem to be in some difficulty. Grace looked up to see a tall man in a weathered duster, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He removed it as he addressed her, revealing sun-bronzed features and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark blonde hair was overdue for a trim, curling slightly at his collar. "It's nothing that concerns you, sir." She turned away, unwilling to explain her humiliating circumstances to a stranger. "Owen Jennings," he said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of hard work. "I ranch about 10 miles outside town." Grace hesitated before briefly shaking his hand. "Grace Gallagher. Pleased to meet you, Miss Gallagher." His eyes moved to her valise and back to her face. "New to Silver Creek?" Briefly. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I'm leaving tomorrow." Owen's gaze drifted to where the attorney stood speaking with several men across the platform, their conversation punctuated by occasional glances in her direction. "Would I be correct in guessing you're the mail-order bride Emmett Pierce sent for?" he asked quietly. Fresh humiliation washed over her. "News travels fast in small towns, I see. Pierce is known for his particular ways," Owen said diplomatically. "And Wilkins there has been flapping his gums to half the town since your train arrived." Grace stiffened. "Well, you needn't concern yourself. As everyone apparently knows, Mr. Pierce found me unsuitable without so much as a meeting. I'll be gone by morning." Owen studied her for a long moment. "Where will you go?" "Boston," she answered automatically, though the prospect filled her with dread. She had no family there anymore, no prospects beyond domestic service in some wealthy household. She had spent the last of her savings on this ill-fated journey west. "Is that what you want?" he asked. The simple question broke something inside her. "What I want," Grace repeated, her voice cracking. "What I want hasn't mattered for a very long time, Mr. Jennings." The station master approached them, looking uncomfortable. "Miss, the boarding house sent word they're full up tonight. Some cattle buyers in town unexpected like." He twisted his cap in his hands. "You're welcome to wait in the depot till morning." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Spending the night on a hard bench in the drafty depot would be the final indignity of this terrible day. Owen cleared his throat. "That won't be necessary." He turned to Grace. "Miss Gallagher, I have a proposition for you." She eyed him warily. "I'm not interested in any proposition from a man I've just met, sir." He had the grace to look abashed. "Nothing improper, I assure you. I'm heading back to my ranch this afternoon. I've got a housekeeper there, Mrs. Abernathy, widow of the former sheriff. She's been with me for 5 years. You could stay at the ranch tonight, and I can bring you back in the morning if you're still set on leaving." Before Grace could respond, the attorney approached, his expression souring when he saw Owen. "Jennings," he said coldly, "this is a private matter." "Doesn't seem very private, considering half the town's talking about it," Owen replied evenly. "Miss Gallagher needs a place to stay tonight." "The boarding house is full," the station master interjected. Mr. Wilkins frowned. "The depot will have to do, then." "She's coming home with me," Owen stated firmly, his tone brooking no argument. The attorney's eyes widened. "That would be most irregular and inappropriate." "Mrs. Abernathy is there as chaperone," Owen said. "Miss Gallagher will have proper accommodations for the night, and I'll bring her back in the morning if that's her choice." "I hardly think," Wilkins began. "I wasn't asking permission." Owen cut him off. He turned to Grace. "Miss Gallagher, the choice is yours." Grace looked between the two men. Mr. Wilkins represented everything about this disaster: Emmett Pierce's rejection, her humiliation, the prospect of returning to Boston defeated. Owen Jennings was an unknown quantity, but he had shown her more consideration in 5 minutes than anyone else had since she'd arrived. "I'll accept your offer, Mr. Jennings," she said, rising from the bench. "Thank you." "This is highly irregular," Wilkins sputtered. "Mr. Pierce will not approve." "Mr. Pierce forfeited any right to approve or disapprove of my actions when he rejected me without so much as a meeting," Grace said coldly. "Good day, Mr. Wilkins." Owen picked up her valise. "My wagon's this way." As they walked away, Grace could feel the stares of onlookers burning into her back. Her reputation would be in tatters by sundown, she was certain, but what did it matter? She would be gone tomorrow, back to a life she tried desperately to escape. Owen's wagon was simple but well-maintained, loaded with supplies from town. He helped her up onto the seat before storing her valise in the back and climbing up beside her. "Are you certain about this, Mr. Jennings?" Grace asked as he took up the reins. "I've caused enough scandal for one day." "Owen," he corrected, "and I've never much cared for town gossip." He clicked to the team of horses, and the wagon lurched forward. Besides, if anyone in Silver Creek had a lick of sense, they'd see that Emmett Pierce is a fool. Grace felt her cheeks warm at the implied compliment. "You don't know me, Mr. Owen. I might be a terrible person." A smile cracked his weathered face. "Maybe so, but you didn't deserve what happened back there." As they left town behind, Grace gradually relaxed. The Montana landscape opened before them, rolling hills dotted with pines, the distant mountains purple against the sky. Despite everything, she couldn't help but find it beautiful. "May I ask why you came west, Miss Gallagher?" Owen inquired after they'd traveled in silence for several miles. "Grace," she offered, "and it's not a very interesting story. My parents died of influenza 2 winters ago. I worked as a seamstress in Boston, but the pay was poor and the conditions worse. When I saw Mr. Pierce's advertisement for a bride, it seemed like a chance at something better." She laughed without humor. "I was clearly mistaken. Pierce owns the largest dry goods store in the county," Owen said. "Never married. Keeps to himself mostly. Town considers him a fine catch." "For someone delicate, apparently," Grace said bitterly. Owen's hands tightened on the reins. "His loss." They fell silent again until Owen spoke. "I came west after the war. Couldn't settle back into Virginia life. Worked as a drover for a few years. Saved enough to buy my own spread. It's not much compared to some, but it's mine." "You fought in the war?" Grace asked. He nodded. "Confederate cavalry. Not something I'm proud of now. But I was 17 and thought I knew everything." His expression darkened. "Found out quick enough I didn't." Grace studied his profile. He couldn't be more than 35, she guessed, but his eyes carried the weight of hard experience. "And your family?" she asked. "Lost my parents before the war. No siblings." He glanced at her. "Ranch is home now." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they crested a hill, and Owen reined in the horses. There it is. Below them spread a modest but well-tended ranch. A 2-story house of solid construction stood near a large barn and several outbuildings. Fenced pastures contained cattle and horses, and smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. "It's lovely," Grace said honestly. "It's home," Owen replied, a note of pride in his voice as he urged the horses forward again. As they approached the house, a stout woman with iron-gray hair emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyebrows rose in surprise when she spotted Grace. "Mrs. Abernathy," Owen called as he drew the wagon to a halt. "We have a guest." He helped Grace down from the wagon and introduced her to the housekeeper, explaining the situation in brief, tactful terms. "That Pierce fellow," Mrs. Abernathy sniffed, "always did think too highly of himself. Well, come in, Miss Gallagher. You must be exhausted. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread just out of the oven." The warmth of the welcome nearly undid Grace's composure. She had expected judgment, not kindness. "Thank you," she managed, following the older woman into the house while Owen unloaded the supplies. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, solid furniture, clean and well-kept, with touches that spoke of a woman's hand in the decorating. Mrs. Abernathy showed her to a small but pleasant bedroom upstairs. "This was Owen's sister-in-law's room when his brother was alive," she explained, then quickly added, "Daniel and his wife passed of typhoid 5 years back, left Owen the ranch. I'll bring up some hot water for washing before supper." Left alone, Grace sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She allowed herself a few minutes of quiet tears before washing her face in the basin provided. By the time Mrs. Abernathy returned with hot water, Grace had composed herself. Supper was a simple but delicious affair: beef stew rich with vegetables, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. Owen and Mrs. Abernathy kept the conversation general, speaking of ranch affairs and local news, never pressing Grace about her situation. After the meal, Owen excused himself to check on a mare about to foal, and Mrs. Abernathy settled in a chair with her knitting. Grace offered to help with the dishes, and the older woman accepted gratefully. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Mrs. Abernathy spoke. "Owen's a good man. Best I've known since my Thomas was taken." "He's been very kind," Grace agreed cautiously. "He needs a wife," the housekeeper continued bluntly. "Ranch needs a woman's touch beyond what these old hands can provide. And he gets lonely, though he'd never admit it." Grace nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'm leaving tomorrow. Back to Boston." The older woman gave her a shrewd look. "Are you? What's waiting for you there?" Grace faltered. "Nothing truly. But I can't stay here." "Why not?" "Montana Territory needs good women. Strong women." Mrs. Abernathy emphasized the last words meaningfully. "Not porcelain dolls like Emmett Pierce thinks he wants. I came to marry a stranger, and he rejected me before we even met," Grace said, her voice low. "I have no place here. Seems to me you've got at least one person who thinks differently." Mrs. Abernathy took the dried plate from Grace's hands. "Sleep on it. Morning brings clearer thoughts." Later, as Grace prepared for bed in the small room, she heard Owen return from the barn. The low murmur of voices drifted up from below Owen and Mrs. Abernathy in conversation. She wondered what they were saying but was too proud to try to eavesdrop. Through the window, she could see the vast Montana sky, ablaze with more stars than she had ever seen in Boston. The majesty of it struck her deeply. Was she really going to turn her back on this wild, beautiful country because one narrow-minded man had rejected her? But what choice did she have? She had no money beyond the return fare Pierce had provided, no connections, no prospects. The thought of staying only to face more rejection and humiliation was unbearable. Grace slept fitfully, troubled by dreams of endless train journeys that never reached their destination. She woke before dawn, her mind no clearer than it had been the night before. Dressing quickly, she made her way downstairs to find Owen already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee before him. "Morning," he said, rising as she entered. "Coffee? Thank you." She accepted the cup he poured, warming her hands around it. "Mrs. Abernathy still sleeping?" "She rises with the sun," Owen replied. "Should be down shortly. Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," Grace lied. "I appreciate your hospitality, but I shouldn't impose any longer. If you could take me back to town for the train." Owen studied her over his coffee cup. "Is that still what you want?" The same question he had asked her yesterday, and still, she had no answer that felt right. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted. He set down his cup. "I might have a proposition." Grace tensed. "I told you yesterday, nothing improper," he assured her quickly. "An arrangement that might benefit us both, if you're willing to hear it." She regarded him warily but nodded for him to continue. "My foreman quit last month, headed to California for the promise of gold. I've been trying to manage everything myself, but with calving season coming and spring roundup after that, I'm stretched thin." He took a breath. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you worked as a seamstress. That means you're good with figures and details, I'd wager." "I kept the books for the shop," Grace confirmed, unsure where he was heading. "I need someone who can manage the accounts, track supplies, organize the men's schedules, and handle correspondence," Owen said. "In short, I need a ranch manager. The pay would be fair, $30 a month plus room and board. You'd have your own quarters in the house, with Mrs. Abernathy as chaperone to keep everything proper." Grace stared at him, stunned by the unexpected offer. "You'd trust such responsibility to a woman you just met?" "I'm a decent judge of character," he said with a slight smile. "And Mrs. Abernathy would skin me alive if I brought someone untrustworthy into the house." "I know nothing about ranching," Grace protested. "You know how to learn, I expect. And you've got a spine of steel to travel across the country on your own." His expression grew serious. "It would be a 3-month trial for both of us. If it doesn't work out, I'll pay your fare to anywhere you want to go, Boston, San Francisco, even back east if that's what you decide." Grace's mind raced. The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. It would give her time to recover from the humiliation of Pierce's rejection, to earn her own money, and to decide her next steps from a position of strength rather than desperation. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't know me." Owen's weathered face softened. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Grace. I got mine when I came west. Maybe this is yours." Before she could respond, Mrs. Abernathy bustled into the kitchen. "Good, you're both up. Flapjacks this morning before the journey to town." She looked between them. "Unless plans have changed?" Owen raised an eyebrow at Grace, the question clear in his eyes. "Aye." Grace took a deep breath. "I believe they have, Mrs. Abernathy. Mr. Jennings has offered me a position as ranch manager. I'm inclined to accept, if you have no objection to my presence in your household." The older woman's face broke into a broad smile. "Objection? Land's sakes, girl, I've been praying for decent female company out here for years. The good Lord works in mysterious ways." After breakfast, Owen insisted on taking Grace to town despite her protests. "You need to settle things properly," he said firmly. "And we need supplies if you're staying." The ride to Silver Creek was quieter than the previous day's journey, both of them contemplating the arrangement they had just made. As they neared town, Grace's stomach knotted with dread at the thought of facing Mr. Wilkins and the town gossips again. Owen seemed to sense her anxiety. "You don't owe anyone explanations," he said quietly. "But if it helps, I'll be right beside you." Grace squared her shoulders. "Thank you, but I need to handle this myself." When they reached the depot, the eastbound train was already at the platform, taking on passengers. Mr. Wilkins paced nervously nearby, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. "Stay with the wagon," Grace instructed Owen. "This won't take long." She approached the attorney, whose relief at seeing her quickly turned to confusion when he realized she carried no luggage. "Miss Gallagher, the train departs in 15 minutes. You must hurry if—" "I won't be on it, Mr. Wilkins," she interrupted calmly. "Please return the ticket money to Mr. Pierce with my regrets." The attorney's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. But the arrangement has been cancelled by Mr. Pierce himself," Grace reminded him. "I am merely acknowledging his decision and making my own." "What exactly do you intend to do?" Wilkins asked, glancing toward the wagon where Owen waited. "That's no longer Mr. Pierce's concern, nor yours." She held out her hand. "The return fare, please. I believe it belongs to Mr. Pierce, not to me." Flustered, Wilkins extracted an envelope from his coat and handed it to her. "This is most irregular. People will talk. They already are." Grace smiled thinly. "Good day, Mr. Wilkins." She returned to the wagon with her head high, aware of the curious stares but refusing to acknowledge them. Owen helped her up onto the seat without comment. "General store next?" he asked as they pulled away from the depot. "Yes," Grace agreed, feeling lighter than she had in days. "I believe I'm going to need work clothes if I'm to be a ranch manager." Owen's lips quirked. "Might want to avoid Pierce's store." "Absolutely," she agreed with a genuine laugh. "I think I've given the town enough to gossip about for one day." They spent the next 2 hours gathering supplies: practical work dresses, sturdy boots, and gloves for Grace, along with the ranch provisions Owen had originally planned to purchase. By the time they headed back to the ranch, the wagon was loaded with goods, and Grace was exhausted but strangely content. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Grace with its naturalness. Each morning, she rose before dawn with Owen and Mrs. Abernathy to share a hearty breakfast before beginning the day's work. Owen patiently taught her the basics of ranch operations: how to maintain the account books, track supplies, manage the schedule of the ranch hands, and handle correspondence with cattle buyers and suppliers. Grace proved a quick study, her experience as a seamstress having given her excellent attention to detail and mathematical skills. She took to the work with determination, eager to prove her worth and to repay Owen's unexpected kindness. Mrs. Abernathy, for her part, seemed delighted to have another woman in the house. She took Grace under her wing, teaching her the rhythms of ranch life and regaling her with stories of her years as a sheriff's wife in the early days of the territory. "Never thought I'd take to ranch life," the older woman confided one evening as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "But after Thomas was killed stopping that bank robbery, I couldn't bear to stay in town with all the memories. When Daniel Jennings offered me a position here, I thought it would be temporary." She chuckled. "That was 8 years ago." "Owen mentioned his brother died of typhoid," Grace said. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. 5 years back. Him and his wife, Louisa, within days of each other, nearly broke Owen. They'd all run this place together since buying it after the war. "He never married?" Grace asked, trying to sound merely conversational. The older woman gave her a knowing look. "Came close once before I arrived. Girl from back east, visiting relatives in town. Seemed smitten with Owen and he with her. But when he proposed, she couldn't stomach the idea of life out here. Went back to Philadelphia or some such place." "I can understand that," Grace said thoughtfully. "The territories aren't for everyone." "No," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Takes a special kind of woman to see the beauty in this harsh land, to build something worthwhile here." As the weeks passed, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to that very beauty. The vast open spaces that had initially seemed overwhelming now represented freedom. The stark mountains against the sky, the rippling grasslands, the clear streams teeming with trout, all of it spoke to something in her soul that had been stifled in Boston's crowded streets. She also found herself increasingly drawn to Owen. His quiet strength, his unfailing fairness with the ranch hands, the gentleness he showed to animals in his care, all revealed a character far deeper than she had initially presumed. He was intelligent, well-read despite his lack of formal education, with a dry wit that often caught her by surprise. For his part, Owen seemed equally intrigued by Grace. He sought her opinion on ranch matters, listened attentively to her suggestions, and gradually began to include her in more aspects of the operation. When she expressed interest in learning to ride properly, He personally selected a gentle mare from his stock and spent hours teaching her. "You're a natural," he commented one afternoon as they rode the boundaries of the property. "Most city folk take much longer to find their seat." "I rode occasionally as a child," Grace admitted. "My grandfather kept a horse for delivering his wares. He was a cobbler. Sometimes he would let me accompany him." "You rarely speak of your life before," Owen observed. Grace shrugged. "Not much to tell. My parents were good people who worked hard. Father was a clerk in an accounting office. Mother took in mending. We weren't wealthy, but we got by. And after they passed, the influenza took them both within days of each other," Grace said, the familiar pain muted now by time. "I sold most of our belongings to pay for their burial and the remaining rent. Took a position at Blackwood's Garment Works as a seamstress. Lived in a boarding house with 5 other working girls." She glanced at him. "Not a very exciting tale. But it shaped you," Owen said. "Made you into someone who would cross a continent on the promise of a better life." "On the promise of marriage to a stranger," Grace corrected wryly. "Not my wisest decision." "I don't know about that," Owen said, his eyes warm. "Seems to have worked out better than expected." The moments stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, before Owen cleared his throat and suggested they head back to the ranch house. As spring roundup approached, the pace of ranch life intensified. Additional hands were hired, cattle needed to be counted and branded, and preparations made for the summer drive to market. Grace found herself working from before dawn until well after dusk, but the exhaustion was oddly satisfying. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, she sat on the porch steps, too tired even to rock in the chair. Owen joined her, offering a cup of coffee laced with whiskey. "For medicinal purposes," he said with a slight smile. "You worked harder than 2 men today." Grace accepted the cup gratefully, savoring the warm burn as she sipped. "I never imagined ranch life would be so brutal," Owen suggested. "Fulfilling," she corrected. "In Boston, I stitched fine dresses for women who would never acknowledge my existence outside the shop. Here, everything I do matters. It's tangible." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's why I could never go back east. Out here, a person's worth is measured by their actions, not their pedigree." "Is that why you offered me a position?" Grace asked, the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks finally finding voice. "Because you saw my worth when Emmett Pierce couldn't?" Owen was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening land. "Partly," he admitted. "But mostly because I saw something in your eyes when you stood up to Wilkins. A fire that reminded me of why I came west in the first place. To build something that was mine on my terms." "And have you built what you wanted?" she asked softly. His gaze returned to her face, intent and searching. Getting closer every day. The air between them changed, charged with possibility. For a breathless moment, Grace thought he might reach for her hand, or perhaps say more. Instead, he drained his cup and stood. "Dawn comes early," he said, his voice rough. "Get some rest, Grace." As he disappeared into the house, Grace remained on the steps, her heart racing with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. She had come to Montana to be a bride, but not to fall in love. Yet here she was, 3 months after Emmett Pierce's rejection, realizing that what had seemed a devastating humiliation had actually been a stroke of incredible fortune. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of raised voices from the yard. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Owen in a heated discussion with a well-dressed man whose back was to her. Mrs. Abernathy stood on the porch, her expression thunderous. "I have every right," the visitor was saying. "The agreement was clearly stated in my advertisement. Passage west in exchange for marriage." With a jolt, Grace recognized Emmett Pierce's voice. She stepped onto the porch, and Pierce turned at the sound, his eyes widening when he saw her. "Miss Gallagher," he said, removing his hat. "I've come to remedy our misunderstanding." Grace stared at him, taking in his immaculate clothes and carefully trimmed mustache. He was handsome in a conventional way, she supposed, but his features seemed small and pinched compared to Owen's weathered countenance. "There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Pierce," she said coldly. "You rejected me before we even met. Mr. Wilkins made your position quite clear." Pierce had the grace to look uncomfortable. Wilkins overstepped. "I merely expressed surprise at your appearance being different than I expected. Recent events have made me reconsider my position." "Recent events?" Grace echoed, confused. Owen's jaw tightened. "He means the gossip. Word spread that you've been living here. Pierce figures his rejected bride being taken in by another man makes him look bad." Pierce bristled. "That's not, isn't it?" Owen cut him off. "You didn't want her until someone else did. Now suddenly you're here to remedy a misunderstanding?" His contempt was palpable. "My private arrangements with Miss Gallagher are none of your concern, Jennings," Pierce snapped. "She came west to be my bride, and I'm prepared to honor that commitment." He turned to Grace. "I've brought a wagon. We can return to town immediately and be married by Reverend Simmons this afternoon." Grace was speechless at his audacity. "Mr. Pierce, I am employed here as Mr. Jennings's ranch manager. I have no intention of marrying you now or ever." Pierce's face darkened. "You signed a contract, Miss Gallagher. I paid for your passage west with the understanding you would become my wife." "A contract you voided when you rejected her," Owen interjected. "Grace returned your money for the ticket. You have no claim on her." "This is absurd," Pierce sputtered. "No respectable woman would choose to live in a bachelor's home rather than accept a proper marriage. Unless—" his eyes narrowed. "Unless your arrangement isn't as innocent as you claim." The implication hung in the air for a moment before Owen's fist connected with Pierce's jaw, sending the smaller man sprawling in the dirt. "Owen!" Grace gasped, rushing down the steps. Pierce scrambled to his feet, hand to his bleeding lip. "You'll regret that, Jennings. I have friends in this territory. Powerful friends." "Get off my land," Owen said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." For a moment, Pierce looked as though he might argue further, but something in Owen's expression changed his mind. He retrieved his hat, brushed ineffectually at his soiled clothes, and stomped to his wagon. "This isn't over," he called as he climbed up. "A woman's reputation is a fragile thing, Miss Gallagher. Remember that." They watched in silence as he drove away, the dust from his wagon hanging in the still morning air. "Are you all right?" Grace asked, noticing Owen flexing his right hand. "Fine," he said shortly. "I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't have lost my temper." "He deserved it," Mrs. Abernathy declared from the porch. "Implying such things about decent folk." Owen shook his head. "Maybe so, but Pierce is right about one thing: he does have influential friends. The territorial governor among them." Grace felt cold despite the warm morning. "What will he do?" "Nothing legal," Owen said. "But he can make things difficult. Suppliers might suddenly be unwilling to extend credit. Cattle buyers might offer lower prices." He looked at Grace, his expression grave. "And he wasn't wrong about reputations. Yours will suffer for being associated with me." "It was already in tatters the moment I was rejected at the depot," Grace pointed out. "I can't imagine it matters much now." "It matters," Owen said softly. "More than you know." The confrontation with Pierce cast a shadow over the ranch for days afterward. Owen became distant, throwing himself into work with a ferocity that left him exhausted each night. Grace tried to engage him in conversation, but he responded with brief, polite answers before finding reasons to be elsewhere. Mrs. Abernathy watched the situation with increasingly evident frustration. "That boy's as stubborn as a mule with a sore hoof," she complained to Grace as they worked in the kitchen one evening. "Always has been. What is he afraid of?" Grace asked, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. "Losing what matters," the older woman replied simply. "He's lost too much already. Parents before he was grown, brother and sister-in-law to disease, nearly lost this ranch twice to drought and cattle thieves." "He's not going to lose the ranch because of me," Grace protested. Mrs. Abernathy gave her a pointed look. "It's not the ranch he's worried about losing, child." Before Grace could respond, the back door opened, and one of the ranch hands appeared, his expression urgent. "Mrs. Abernathy, Miss Gallagher boss says to tell you there's a fire moving this way. Probably lightning strike in the north pasture. Says to pack essentials and be ready to evacuate if it gets too close." Grace's heart raced as she and Mrs. Abernathy quickly gathered important documents, photographs, and a few personal items. Outside, they could see an ominous orange glow on the horizon, growing brighter against the twilight sky. "Should we hitch the wagon?" Grace asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Not yet," Mrs. Abernathy said, surprisingly calm. "Owen and the boys will try to dig a firebreak. If that fails, we'll need to move fast. But there's no sense in panicking until we know." The hours that followed were the longest of Grace's life. The men worked tirelessly, digging trenches and setting backfires to create a buffer zone between the approaching wildfire and the ranch buildings. The wind shifted erratically, sometimes driving the flames closer, sometimes offering respite. Near midnight, Grace brought water and food to the exhausted men. She found Owen at the edge of the firebreak, his face streaked with soot, eyes red from smoke. "You should be at the house ready to leave," he said when he saw her. "Mrs. Abernathy has everything prepared," Grace replied, offering him the canteen. "I couldn't just wait and do nothing." Owen drank deeply before handing back the canteen. "Fire's turned eastward for now. If the wind holds, we might be spared the worst of it." "And if it doesn't?" she asked. His eyes met hers, fatigue and worry evident. "Then we lose everything I've spent 15 years building." "Not everything," Grace said firmly. "Buildings can be rebuilt, herds replenished. What matters is that no one gets hurt." Owen's expression softened. "When did you get so wise about ranch life, city girl?" "I had a good teacher," she replied with a small smile. A shout from further down the line drew their attention. The wind had shifted again, driving flames toward a section of the firebreak that wasn't yet complete. Owen immediately rushed to help, leaving Grace to return to the house with the empty containers. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed. The fire had veered east, sparing the ranch buildings and most of the grazing land. The men trudged back, exhausted beyond words, faces blackened with soot, clothes singed in places. Grace and Mrs. Abernathy had hot food waiting and basins of water for washing. As the hands ate and then sought their beds in the bunkhouse, Owen remained at the kitchen table, too tired even to eat. "You need to rest," Grace told him, removing his plate of barely touched food. "Too much to do," he mumbled. "Need to check how many head we lost. Assess the damage to the north pasture fences." "It can wait a few hours," she insisted. "You can't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Mrs. Abernathy nodded in agreement. "Listen to the girl, Owen. She's talking sense." With their combined insistence, Owen finally allowed himself to be led upstairs to his bedroom. Grace helped him remove his boots, noticing a nasty burn on his right forearm that he hadn't mentioned. "This needs tending," she said, gently examining the angry red skin. "It's nothing," he protested weakly. "I'll get the salve and bandages," she said, ignoring his objection. When she returned with medical supplies, Owen was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring vacantly at the wall. He didn't resist as she cleaned the burn and applied salve before wrapping it in clean bandages. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with fatigue, "for everything." "Rest now," Grace instructed, helping him lie back on the bed. As she turned to leave, his hand caught hers. "I thought I might lose you last night," he murmured, already half asleep. "Couldn't bear that." Grace's heart stuttered. "You won't lose me," she promised softly, but Owen was already asleep, his fingers relaxing their grip on hers. She stood watching him for a moment. This man who had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most, who had seen value in her when others hadn't, who had fought through the night to protect what he'd built. In that quiet moment, Grace acknowledged what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She had fallen in love with Owen Jennings. The realization should have frightened her. She had come west to marry a stranger for practical reasons: security, a home, perhaps eventually affection. Instead, she had found herself captivated by a man who asked nothing of her but her competence and honesty. Grace slipped from the room, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, she encountered Mrs. Abernathy, who took one look at her face and nodded knowingly. "About time you figured it out," the older woman said. "Now, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Grace replied, startled by the direct question. "Owen offered me employment, not courtship. He's never indicated he sees me as anything more than his ranch manager." Mrs. Abernathy snorted inelegantly. "That man looks at you like a starving man eyes a feast. He's just too honorable or too stubborn to act on it while you're in his employ." "That's ridiculous," Grace protested, though her pulse quickened at the suggestion. "Owen barely speaks to me most days." "Because he's fighting himself every minute," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "Mark my words, girl. I've known that man for 8 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." With that pronouncement, the housekeeper headed downstairs, leaving Grace standing in the hallway with her thoughts in turmoil. The day after the fire brought Pierce back to the ranch, this time accompanied by the county sheriff. Grace was in the barn, taking inventory of supplies, when Owen came to find her, his expression grim. "Pierce is here with Sheriff Taylor," he said without preamble. "He's filed a complaint, claiming I assaulted him without provocation and that I'm holding you here against your will." Grace's mouth fell open in astonishment. "That's absurd. I'm here by choice. I know that. But Pierce is spinning quite a tale in town about how I stole his mail-order bride and am keeping you in inappropriate conditions." Owen's jaw tightened. "The sheriff needs to hear from you directly." Grace nodded, straightening her work dress and following Owen to the house. In the front room, Sheriff Taylor, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and watchful eyes, stood awkwardly while Pierce sat in an armchair as if he owned the place. "Miss Gallagher," the sheriff acknowledged her with a nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to clear up some serious allegations." "Of course, Sheriff," Grace replied calmly. "I'm happy to answer any questions." "Mr. Pierce claims that Mr. Jennings assaulted him without provocation during his last visit here, and furthermore, that you are being kept at this ranch against your will in." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Improper circumstances. Both claims are false," Grace stated firmly. "Mr. Jennings struck Mr. Pierce only after Pierce implied that I was engaged in immoral behavior. As for being held against my will, that's utterly ridiculous. I am employed here as ranch manager with a proper contract and wages. Mrs. Abernathy serves as housekeeper and chaperone, ensuring all proprieties are observed. She's clearly been intimidated," Pierce interjected. She traveled across the country to be my bride, Sheriff. Our arrangement was legally binding until Jennings interfered. Our arrangement ended the moment you rejected me at the train depot, Mr. Pierce, Grace countered, her voice sharp with anger. You instructed your attorney to send me back east because I wasn't the delicate woman you desired. Only when you learned I had found employment with Mr. Jennings did you suddenly decide to honor our original agreement. The sheriff looked between them, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Pierce did file a complaint about the assault. Which I don't deny, Owen said. I struck him after he insulted Miss Gallagher's character. It was wrong of me to lose my temper, and I'm prepared to pay whatever fine is appropriate. Sheriff Taylor nodded slowly. Standard fine for simple assault is $10, assuming Mr. Pierce doesn't wish to pursue further charges. That's it, Pierce exclaimed. He attacks me, steals my bride, and gets a slap on the wrist? Mr. Pierce, the sheriff said with evident patience. Miss Gallagher has made it clear she is not being held against her will, and that she considers your prior arrangement terminated. As for the assault, Mr. Jennings admits to it and is willing to pay the fine. Unless you have evidence of more serious crimes, that concludes official business. Pierce's face reddened. This is outrageous. I demand. You've made your demands quite clear. The sheriff interrupted. Now, I suggest you return to town before this situation escalates further. For a moment, it seemed Pierce might argue, but something in the sheriff's steady gaze changed his mind. He stood, straightening his jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. This isn't over, he said, glaring at Owen. The governor will hear about this. After Pierce stormed out, Sheriff Taylor sighed heavily. Sorry about that, Jennings. Pierce has been raising a stink in town for days. Wouldn't let up until I agreed to ride out here. Owen nodded. No apology needed. You were doing your job. For what it's worth, the sheriff added. Most folks in Silver Creek think Pierce is a pompous fool. His version of events didn't sit right with me from the start. He turned to Grace. Miss Gallagher, I hope you found Montana more welcoming than your initial reception suggested. I have, Sheriff, she replied with a genuine smile. More than I ever expected. After the sheriff departed, Owen and Grace stood in silence for a moment before he spoke. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said quietly. Pierce won't give up easily. His pride won't allow it. I'm not afraid of Emmett Pierce, Grace declared. He has no power over me. Owen's expression was troubled. Maybe not legally, but he can make life difficult. Your reputation. My reputation is my own concern, she interrupted. And frankly, I care far more about what you think of me than what Emmett Pierce or the gossips in Silver Creek might say. Something shifted in Owen's eyes at her words. A flash of emotion quickly masked. I think you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, he said, his voice low and intense. And I think I've been a coward. Grace's heart stuttered. A coward? You're the bravest man I've ever met. Not about this. He took a step closer. Not about how I feel when I see you each morning at breakfast, or watch you working with the accounts, or riding across the pastures like you were born to it. Owen, Grace whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I offered you employment because you needed a fresh start, he continued. But I've been fighting myself every day since, trying not to want more than that. Trying to be honorable when all I can think about is how much I want to ask you to stay not as my ranch manager, but as my wife. The words hung in the air between them, breathtaking in their simplicity and honesty. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the emotions surging through her. I came west to marry a stranger, she said finally. I never expected to fall in love with one instead. Owen's face transformed, hope replacing the uncertainty in his eyes. Grace, Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears now falling freely. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll be your wife. Yes to everything. With a groan that seemed torn from deep within him, Owen closed the distance between them, gathering her in his arms and kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. Grace responded in kind, pouring months of suppressed longing into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I should have said something sooner. We both should have, Grace acknowledged. But we're saying it now, and that's what matters. Pierce will make trouble, Owen warned, still holding her close. Grace smiled. Let him try. We've faced fire and survived. What's one disgruntled shopkeeper compared to that? Owen laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief. When did you become such an optimist, city girl? When a cowboy said, "She's coming home with me," and changed my life forever, Grace replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him again. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Abernathy beaming like a proud mother and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Sheriff Taylor attended, as did several neighbors who had come to know and respect Owen over the years. Emmett Pierce made good on his threats, using his influence to create difficulties for the Jennings ranch. Suppliers in Silver Creek suddenly found reasons not to extend credit. Cattle buyers offered prices well below market value. But what Pierce hadn't counted on was Grace's determination and business acumen. She established relationships with suppliers in neighboring towns, negotiated directly with a meat packing company in Chicago, and even convinced the railroad to add a loading stop closer to the ranch, cutting transportation costs significantly. By the end of their first year of marriage, the Jennings ranch was more profitable than ever, and Pierce's campaign of pettiness had largely been forgotten by the townsfolk, who had more pressing concerns than old grudges. You've built something remarkable here, Owen told Grace on the evening of their first anniversary as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. This ranch has never run so smoothly. We built it together, she corrected, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. Their first child due in the spring. Just as we're building our family. Owen placed his hand over hers, his eyes filled with wonder at the new life growing beneath their fingers. When I saw you sitting alone at that depot, I never imagined all this would follow. No, Grace smiled. Even then, some part of me knew. When you said, "She's coming home with me," it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. It was the best decision I ever made, Owen said, drawing her close against the cooling evening air. For both of us, Grace agreed, nestling into her husband's embrace as the last rays of sunlight painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the years that followed, the story of the mail-order bride who was rejected at the depot only to find true love with a determined cowboy became something of a legend in Silver Creek. Travelers passing through might hear it told in the saloon or the general store, no longer owned by Emmett Pierce, who eventually sold his business and moved to San Francisco. But for Grace and Owen Jennings, raising their growing family on the prosperous ranch they ran together, it wasn't legend but the simple truth of how a journey that began in humiliation had led to the greatest happiness either of them had ever known. As their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after Grace's mother grew into a young woman, she would sometimes ask to hear the story of how her parents met. Grace would always begin the same way. I stepped off a train believing my future was decided, only to discover it was just beginning. And Owen would add, with a wink to his beloved wife, sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take.